It is my pleasure to introduce my boss, the president of Rutgers University, Richard L. McCormick. Dr. McCormick has been a strong supporter of the university's research on climate change, which he highlighted in his annual addresses, and he has strongly encouraged the university's efforts in solar energy and energy conservation, and all you have to do is go to the Livingston campus to see the products of his efforts. So please welcome President Richard L. McCormick.
Thank you, Jim, and a warm welcome to everyone. Please proceed with your lunch as it is served, as I and a few others will have the privilege of speaking. On behalf of Rutgers University, I want to welcome everyone here today. Rutgers is really pleased and proud to be hosting a dialogue on an issue that is so compelling for our state and our nation and the world. It's a very special pleasure to have Governors Kaine and Florio with us. They have been leaders for New Jersey over a very long period of time in advancing initiatives in the area of climate change and elsewhere that draw upon leading-edge science and from it create sound public policy. So Governors Kaine and Florio, please know how deeply you are admired for that, and we thank you for your presence today. I also thank and welcome our keynote speaker, Captain Tony Miller, and Mr. Adam Markham from Clean Air, Cool Planet. To both of you, we say thanks for taking the time to be with us today. Let me also thank, and here I look across the entire room, let me thank the constellation of scientists, engineers, social scientists, public health professionals, and policymakers, both from academia and from the larger worlds of which we are a part. Thanks, too, to the representatives of the state and local governments and the federal government, from the private sector and the nonprofit sector. Frankly, it will take representatives, it will take people, it will take men and women from all of those areas, all of those walks of life, all of those disciplines, and all of those professions to address the challenges we face with respect to our planet, and indeed that's what's going on here today. It's vital to have such wide representation so we can have a full conversation about climate change and a concerted statewide effort here in New Jersey to plan for its impacts and its consequences. Among my thanks, last but not least, to PSE&G for supporting the university in our efforts to facilitate this conversation, and I thank you. Here at Rutgers, as many of you know, we have a tagline, Jersey Roots, Global Reach. The issue of climate change and how to adapt to it is so closely connected to that idea and to our mission as the State University of New Jersey. Climate change, along with renewable energy, is a hugely important area, actually a hugely important multiplicity of areas where Rutgers can make and is making a huge difference. We're capitalizing on our interdisciplinary strengths, on the availability of resources, and on the relevance of the needs in our state and our nation to make contributions to these areas, and we're terribly proud of doing so. Our efforts to do that are aided by the fact that we have two visionary deans, Jim Hughes of the Blaustein School, whom you have already met, and Bob Goodman of the School of Environmental and Biological Sciences. I'm not sure if Bob is back in the room. I know he was there this morning. Together, Deans Goodman and Hughes and their faculty colleagues and their colleagues as well in industry and the nonprofit sector and in all levels of government have shown a collaborative commitment to bridging science and policy so that a concerted, pardon my voice, systematic planning approach can benefit our state and the nation and the world. So I'm enormously excited by the congeries of individuals who are here today, by the breadth of talents and institutions that you represent, and above all, by the challenge that we collectively have. The challenge we face has been highlighted, certainly within the past year, by the intense weather that those of us in New Jersey and around the nation and the world have had. It has focused attention on the immediacy and importance of these issues, and I commend you for spending today and bringing your talents together across all kinds of lines to address them with us. Thank you and welcome.
Thank you, President McCormick. It is now my pleasure to introduce Adam Markham, Executive Director of Clean Air, Cool Planet, a position he has held since the year 2000. Prior to being the founding director at Clean Air, Cool Planet, he worked at the World Wildlife Fund's International Climate Campaign for 12 years. He is the author and editor of several books about pollution and climate change impacts on tropical forest ecosystems and has published in numerous journals. Adam?
Thank you again, and thank you, President McCormick, and it's great to see both Governors Kaine and Florio here. Thank you for honoring us today. It's wonderful to see everybody here. I run Clean Air, Cool Planet. We, as I mentioned earlier, we have been the co-organizer of this event with Rutgers, and Rutgers has already shown us some of the depth and strength of their commitment to the issue, and the faculty here that are doing country-leading work, nation-leading work on climate change issues. As we are here today, the international climate change talks have just kicked off in Durban in South Africa. When I worked for World Wildlife Fund, I went to many of those early negotiating sessions and was involved in many of the first and second Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change meetings. 10 years ago, with the founding of Clean Air, Cool Planet, I resolved to move away from the international activities, the lack of action in Washington, and try to work at the more local and regional level, trying to forge leadership here in the Northeast and the Mid-Atlantic. And the work that we do now is working mainly with universities, municipalities, and the private sector to try and find leadership actions on climate change. So as the international talks happen in Durban, you know, my email is buzzing with side meetings. There are thousands of diplomats and nonprofits there, side meetings at every possible moment, many of them about adaptation. I'm glad to be here in New Jersey at an adaptation side meeting because it's here that people are going to be at the cutting edge of actually dealing with climate change. Many people still, as you know, don't believe that climate change is affecting us. We know that there are changes. Most people can agree, however, that we need to prepare for whatever those changes are. And that's what we're here to talk about. People may not agree on the science. They may not agree on whether climate change is happening or not, although I imagine most people in this room agree on both things. But what we do need to do is engage the wider society in preparing for change. That change is already here. It's going to get worse. We've started to see some of the economic and social implications today. This afternoon, we're going to work in small groups to start thinking about how to plan for that change. And so I now just want to hand back to the Dean so that you can hear the key speakers, the keynote speakers for lunchtime. And thank you again for coming. I look forward to this afternoon. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Adam. It is now time for our distinguished keynote speaker today, Captain Tony Miller. Captain Miller is now on the staff of the Oceanographer of the Navy, serving as the Deputy Director, Task Force Climate Change. Prior to his current duties, he commanded the Naval Oceanographic Anti-Submarine Warfare Center at Stennis Space Center. He has received numerous prestigious awards during his naval career, and I urge you to look at his impressive resume, which is in your packet. And he has a Doctor of Philosophy degree in physical oceanography. Captain Miller?
Good afternoon, and thank you for that introduction, Dean. Governors Florio and Kaine, Dr. McCormick, thank you. I'm happy to have the opportunity to talk to you here today. I am Commander Tony Miller, the Deputy Director of the Task Force Climate Change for the Navy, and I work for Rear Admiral Dave Titley, who is the Oceanographer of the Navy and the Director of the Task Force. When Admiral Titley tells people about how he came to be in the position that he's in now, he starts out telling about his love of weather from the age of 4. Now, I can't go back that far, but I will tell you a little bit about my time at the Naval Academy, which you see up here, when I was there in the mid to late 1980s. I showed up to the Naval Academy and chose English as my major. I love to read, I love to write, and I thought, I'll get to go to a lot of classes where I can read these great books. We'll talk about the books in class, write some papers. This will be a pretty good deal. But it didn't work out quite that way because the program had a foreign language requirement, 4 semesters of foreign language, which I had never had before, and I signed up for a class that I thought was going to be beginning level French, only to find out that everybody else in there had at least 2 or 3 years of French in high school before they got there. About 3 weeks into the course, the professor stopped speaking English in the class and forbid any of us from speaking English in the class. And before I finished that first semester with a solid D-, I knew I had to look for another major if I ever wanted to graduate. So I started looking around. I found the oceanography department. I said, this is pretty interesting, and decided that was the way for me to go. It took a lot of sales on my part. The department chairman wasn't convinced that I could really do it. He saw oceanography as a much more difficult program than English, and he wasn't sure I was serious, so I had to make up a couple of classes in summer school, and they eventually let me in, and I really enjoyed it. Now, I also had some meteorology in that program, and I enjoyed that as well. I enjoyed it all so much, in fact, that I attempted to join the Navy's meteorology and oceanography career field after graduation. But at that time, they weren't allowing anybody to go directly into that community. So I was a surface warfare officer, a ship driver for about 5 years. And at the end of that time, I was able to transfer into the meteorology and oceanography community, where I've been ever since. Being in the new community also afforded me some additional educational opportunities. I was able to go out to the Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey, California for a master's degree in meteorology and oceanography. And as the dean told you just a moment ago, I was able to go back again several years later for a PhD in oceanography. And that education has laid a lot of the foundation for getting me into the job that I'm in now, assisting Admiral Titley in this task force. Now, I want to back up in time a bit to 1979. Now, that is the year that the Navy started using satellites to map the ice edge in the Arctic Ocean. They'd already been mapping the ice for some time before that, but when they were able to do it by satellite, it gave a much more accurate picture and a picture that could be updated much more frequently. So that began in 1979, and the Navy's continuously mapped the Arctic ice edge ever since then. By the time I was studying oceanography at the Naval Academy, a few people had begun to notice some changes in this Arctic ice. Now, I'm sure you all know the ice, a lot of the ice melts, the whole ice coverage shrinks back in the summertime, and then it grows again in the winter. The minimum's about in September, and then it grows again in the winter, and then next year it'll shrink again. And so on. This is a natural cycle that happens every year. But what people began to notice was these summertime minimums were getting smaller and smaller each year. At the same time, submariners who were working under the ice began to notice that the thickness of the ice was less and less as well. Now, these decreases in ice coverage and volume have continued through now. And in fact, the year 2007, you can see up here, was a record low year for ice coverage. And that really started to get the attention of a lot of people. It got the attention of our senior leadership in the Navy. And also, they started to put some guidance out in preparing to start understanding this and preparing for how these changes will affect the Navy. This was introduced in the Cooperative Strategy for the 21st Century, CS21, which directed us to prepare for operating in this changing environment. President Bush also issued the National Security Presidential Directive 66, NSPD 66, just before he left office in 2009. And President Obama quickly adopted that as his own. That gives us a not really an Arctic strategy, but it gives us some policy statements on how we're to operate with respect to national security in the Arctic. The Chief of Naval Operations at the time, Admiral Gary Roughead, asked Admiral Titley to come to Washington, D.C. and stand up this task force in 2009, and he did so. The task force is the way has come up with a couple of roadmaps, one for the Arctic and one for climate change in general. And both of these roadmaps are a series of action items which the Navy will do to prepare to ensure that we're ready to operate in this changing environment. Now, one thing I want to say is that we're not, everything we do is based on a consensus of science. We want to follow science, but we're really not manned or funded to actually do the science ourselves in our office. So forming partnerships is very important to our group. We work closely with the research activities in the Navy, with other DoD and interagency groups, and also with academia and even foreign governments. So that partnership is very important. That's a lot of what we do is reach out with other people and work together with them, because we do have such minimal manning. Assessments are a very important thing that we're doing right now as well. We've done a capabilities-based assessment to determine how ready our forces are to operate in the Arctic. We've done a mission-based analysis to look at what potential missions we could be called upon to execute in the Arctic. And we're also starting a multi-year installation vulnerability study to look at how susceptible our bases around the world are to climate change. And I'll talk a little more about that in a bit. All of this is done to inform policy and resource decisions, really to make recommendations on how the Navy will invest the money that we spend. We keep monitoring the conditions, and we will update those roadmaps as necessary. The roadmaps lay out a period of 5 years, but we'll update them each 4 years, roughly aligned with the quadrennial defense review. As we get new guidance, as conditions change, we need to update our plans, we'll do that. And the idea is that we don't want to have a plan that's so short-term that we spend all our time updating the plan instead of doing anything with it. But on the other hand, it needs to be short enough that it can remain relevant and be updated frequently enough to ensure that it's always relevant. We certainly don't want to lay out a plan for the next 20 to 30 years and just forget about that. You know, nobody would be here today if we were all operating on a plan from 1980, probably. Now, you see the picture in the middle there is Admiral Jonathan Greenert. He was the Vice Chief of Naval Operations when these roadmaps were produced, and he signed those. I have him up there because he was the #2 man in the Navy headquarters then. He since has replaced Admiral Roughead as the Chief of Naval Operations. He's our top uniformed officer in the Navy, and he's the man who signed these roadmaps out. Now, having that buy-in from leadership is really what it takes to get things done, and that's been very good for us. That we're not trying to push our leadership in a given direction. Our leadership is on board, and they want to ensure that we're doing the right things and making the investments that we need to in the future. Now, I want to go back to the Arctic real quick, because one of these entire roadmaps is devoted to the Arctic. The largest concern we have in the near term is the Arctic Ocean. We've noticed this more and more open water in the Arctic each year, and along with that's come increased maritime activity. We've seen some increases in shipping, some increases in tourism, though both of those are still pretty small at this point. Big changes are coming, though, in natural resource exploitation. Right now, there are at least 5 or 6 different projects for oil and gas exploration that are either ongoing or planned over the next few years. And as I said, we expect to see more and more of this kind of activity continue, and that's certain to create more Navy missions. I do realize that I've talked a lot about the Arctic already, and that is the #1 concern for the Navy, but it is a remote harsh, largely uninhabited area that's probably not at the highest part of your interest level here in New Jersey or any other, local area in the U.S. So I want to bring things back a little closer to home for a minute here. A couple of weeks ago, I was talking to Dr. Alan Betts, who is a prominent climate scientist, researcher, and has been well regarded for several decades. He told me that in his state of Vermont, the climatological growing season has typically been about 135 days each year. But over the last few decades, it has been increasing an average of 3.7 days per decade. So now the growing season in western Vermont is a full 2 weeks longer than it was 40 years ago. Now this growing season typically ends with frost in September that triggers the changing of the colors that New England is so famous for. But this year was an anomalous year, even in this kind of era of changes. The growing season was a record 191 days long. And it ended very abruptly with the snowstorm and heavy frost on October 28th. So much longer period and a much more abrupt change instead of that gradual change that they normally see. At the same time that they saw this long growing season, the weather pattern was more stable across much of the country than it normally is. So we saw what the map up here depicts, record droughts in Texas and New Mexico, along with record high precipitation levels from Ohio through New England, including here, right? So now, again, as has been said several times this morning, we can't, say that any one event there is directly, linked to climate change. But and I also, again, point out this is an anomalous year, but that trend of changes of increasing length of growing season every year is certainly, that's not a single event. That is a real measurable trend that's been going on for some time now. Now, all these things actually don't change what the Navy does that much because we typically play the away game. We're a Navy that's deployed around the world, and dealing with these issues here in the United States is typically not something the Navy's called upon to do. But these same kind of things are happening around the world. Many of you probably know that the Navy's been engaged in humanitarian assistance, disaster relief type missions for many years. Some examples of those are responding to the populations that were affected by a tsunami in Indonesia a few years ago, by earthquake in Haiti in 2010, by the earthquake and tsunami in Japan that happened early in 2011. Now, none of these are climate change related, but they are examples of the kind of natural disasters that happen that the Navy's been called upon to respond to go and provide assistance to those affected populations to try to help them, recover, dig themselves out and get back to normal again. Now, though, we expect with disruptions and with changes in the precipitation pattern, like what I talked about between Texas and New England in the United States, as we see those kind of changes around the world, changes in precipitation patterns, more of these extreme flooding events and other things of that nature, we certainly expect that the Navy will be called upon to do more of those kind of things. One thing I would like to point out there is Dr. Jeff Mazo in his book Climate Conflict tells us that the zone of Earth which is most susceptible to these kinds of changes in precipitation patterns from climate change is also the zone of the Earth where the largest number of very fragile nations lies. Nations that are much less developed, than the United States, that have much less adaptive capacity, so nations that require much more outside assistance when they do have extreme events. So we can expect then, as I said, to be called upon more and more to respond to these sorts of things. Now, another thing that I want to mention here, which should also be of interest to you as a coastal state here, is sea level rise. This, again, has been covered in various levels of detail by several people today. But it's certainly something the Navy is very interested in, because we have installations both in the United States and around the world that are very near sea level. We have to have a place to bring our ships in. Those facilities are very important to us. So it's also important to know how a rising sea will affect all those investments and our ability to operate out of them in the future. The IPCC's fourth assessment projected 18 to 59 centimeters of sea level rise by the end of the century. That did not take into account melting glaciers, though. So more recent projections frequently range between 1 and 2 meters for global sea level rise by the end of the century, and you can certainly find a number of different values for this. But the exact number we expect the global average to be is largely unimportant when you're looking at the effects at any location, because sea level rise is different for every location out there for several reasons. First, we know that there will be some sea level rise that's a static sea level rise, just due to warming the ocean. Warming that water makes it less dense. It fills more volume than it did before. So that's pretty much global. There's a dynamic sea level change, just like the atmosphere is higher or lower in different locations due to the high and low pressure systems out there. The same is true for the oceans, though it's not nearly as noticeable because the water's more dense. While this change can be hundreds of meters in the atmosphere, it's on the order of 1 meter in the ocean. But this is another thing the Navy's mapped over the years by satellite. Looking from satellite-based altimeters, you can measure the height of that elevation of the sea surface, and it really is a topography that's up and down all over due to the ocean circulation that moves the water. Now, in addition to that, as has also been mentioned, uplifting or subsidence of the land creates an apparent change in the sea level as well. And that, again, is different at different places. So, due to the dynamic sea surface height and changes in the elevation of land, there are some areas that could actually see their sea level decrease, while others will experience much, much greater than the global average for sea level rise. All of this is very important to us in the Navy to understand, and so we've just started a multi-year installation vulnerability study to look at this. Our approach is risk-based because we need to look at what are the expected sea level rise impacts at each of our bases, how much do we expect the sea level to rise, and then how much do we expect that rise to impact the infrastructure on that base. Now, this first phase in the study is just to go through and look at, to get estimates on both of those things, and that way we can compile a list of which bases have the greatest risk and the least risk, rank those, and draw some cutoff line where those below the line, we can make a judgment to say these facilities are probably okay. We don't need to invest a lot more in these, and we certainly hope that the large majority of them will fall into that category. But they won't all fall in that category, so we need to know where the risk is of having greater impacts. We make that list, and we go back again, study in much greater detail there to determine what we really think the impacts are going to be and when we think they will be. how they'll affect the infrastructure so we can make the right decisions, the right investments to adapt to that. But not only that, but to make the right investments at the right time. And everything we're doing here, whether it's adapting our bases to sea level rise or buying capabilities to operate in the Arctic, in both cases, we need to balance the opportunity cost of investing too early against the risk of not being prepared. We certainly have a finite budget already, and every indication is that it's not going to get any bigger. It will probably get much smaller than it is. So we have to carefully use the money that we do have and not buy too early. But if we wait too long, then we won't have the capabilities that we need. So balancing that risk, investing at the right time is what we seek to do. And the end objective really is mission readiness. We're assessing these risks, managing the risk to ensure that we make the right investments at the right time so we have the capabilities to perform the missions that we're called upon. Maintaining that mission readiness is really the important thing, and that's why the task force was stood up in the first place. The Navy recognizes that changes are coming. We're not really prepared to meet everything that could happen, and our leadership recognized that, wanted to make sure that we are ready to meet those challenges, and so that's exactly what we're doing in the end to ensure that we're ready to meet all those missions. That's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you for an excellent presentation. It is now my pleasure to introduce the first of our two distinguished governors. First will be Governor Thomas H. Kean. He was a two-term governor of the state of New Jersey and is now chairman of the board of the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation and of the Carnegie Corporation of New York. As you all know, Governor Kean headed the National Commission on Terrorist Attacks upon the United States, which made recommendations that resulted in the largest intelligence reform in the nation's history. Governor Kean?
Dean, thank you very much. And Captain, thank you very much for that presentation. You know, sometimes I think if some people in our country don't believe in global warming, other people do. The two largest icebreakers in the world have now been built by China, which has no ice. So that tells us something about the way the rest of the world is thinking. You know, I was going through my file. A member of my staff came up with this the other day. New Jersey Global Climate Change Initiative, almost a quarter of a century ago, in which 5 or 6 of the departments of state government came together and did a report recognizing the fact that global warming was real and that the state of New Jersey ought to be doing something about it and coming out with a series of recommendations, both for New Jersey and for the nation as a whole, including how we construct buildings, including how we drive our automobiles, including a lot of the things which you all know already. I point that out because we've known this for a long, long time. We've known what was coming. We've known the science. And I'm delighted to be up here with Jim Florio because, you know, as I think back, he's a lot older than he looks. I think Governor Florio has been a leader in environmental matters for 40 years. And I was thinking back to the time we spent in the legislature. But we have known, and you know so well, you wouldn't be here otherwise, and so many of you have been working in this field, and we know the science. And we know the science is accurate. And we know there are a number of very important scientists who come up with very important recommendations that we have ignored. I was in a group the other day where there were some people who said, you know, I think there's only 50-50 chance that global warming will be a problem. 50-50 chance. And I told them, go and listen to Dick Cheney. And they said, what? I said, go and listen to Dick Cheney, because I remember when Dick Cheney was defending our invasion of Iraq. And Dick Cheney said if there was 1 in 100 chances that Saddam Hussein has weapons of mass destruction, and if we don't do something, it would be both catastrophic and irreversible. And I said to these people, if there is only a small chance that we're right, it will be catastrophic and irreversible. And it seems to me that the science is clear. We're to confront those who don't believe in the science for the ignorant people they are. And we ought to move ahead on public policy, because it seems to me the other problem is that much as we know in this room, it's not going to do us a lot of good if we can't get the mechanism moving, if we can't get our leaders to lead, if we can't get the public convinced that we're right and where we have to go. And we are failing in the Western democracies on a whole number of issues now where we cannot seem to proceed on what we know is in the public interest. And that's not the history of this country. I mean, we have, think of our great presidents, often came up with difficult issues and then brought the Congress and the public with them, and great leaders in Congress to help. Lincoln, Teddy Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt, Harry Truman, Jack Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson, even Richard Nixon confronted difficult issues and brought the public and the Congress along with them. Somehow we have got to get that spirit back. Because just as if we don't do anything about economic issues, if we don't do anything about climate change, if we have a whole presidential campaign where climate change is simply on the side here somewhere, and we don't say what we're going to do about it and how we're going to move, then this country and this world and our children and our grandchildren will be in a very, very difficult place. So I just thank you for holding this conference today. I thank you, all of you, for coming here. I thank the captain. I thank President McCormick. I thank all of you for everything you're doing. Keep it up, but we've got to make the leaders lead if we're going to get anywhere. Thank you.
My final introduction today is a good colleague of mine from the Blaustein School for the past 16 years, Governor James J. Florio. He is now University Professor Emeritus for Public Policy at the Blaustein School and is still a Senior Fellow at the Blaustein School's Heldrick Center. While a member of Congress, Governor Florio authored the Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation and Liability Act, known as the Superfund Law. And lately, he has also served as the chairman of the Pinelands Commission in New Jersey. Governor Florio.
Well, thank you very much to the governor, to the president, captain, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very pleased to be here, and I thank the dean for the nice introduction. Well, I have to confess, I'm a little apprehensive about nice introductions, since I had an experience a while back when I went to a dinner that I was being awarded a nice honor, and the fellow who was making the presentation said some very nice things, and then he concluded by saying that Governor Florio is the very model of what a public official should be, which I thought was fairly nice. So I went home and I told my wife about it. And Lucinda very pointedly reminded me that the dictionary definition of model is a small replica of the real thing. So she works to keep me humble on a fairly regular basis. But I am pleased to be able to be here and be part of this program. and to be asked to say some things about and react to the comments of the speaker. This is a very impressive gathering. I mean, the session this morning was very, very good, and I'm very impressed to be able to be part of it. It's interesting, about 12 or 13 years ago, I was asked to speak at a forum on this topic at Ramapo State College. And I remember going to it, and it was very interesting because there were a lot of serious questions that were asked in a very sincere way. You know, is this problem real? Is this problem serious? Did we cause it? Is there anything we can do about it? And what is it going to cost to do anything about it? Well, I think over that period of time since then, all those questions, except maybe the last one, have been answered in the affirmative. But the answer to the question, what's it going to cost, is now also being framed commendably in the shape of what's it going to cost if we do something about it. But then, commendably, as I say, it's also being framed in terms of what's it going to cost us if we don't do something about it. And that's something I think that is very significant for us to appreciate. I think we'll also come to appreciate that left unattended, the consequences of not doing anything about this problem are very dramatic and maybe even extreme. Extreme not only for our state, for our nation, but for, in fact, our world. Weather abnormalities in the relationship to climate change is, again, as has been said a couple of occasions today, not scientifically conclusive. But I think the very fact that there is the debate going on about this whole issue has made the public's level of awareness to the issue and the potential for a relationship a very good thing, because the public is now becoming much more engaged in this debate, and that is a good thing for public awareness and as we try to formulate policy. I want to share an observation with you that really is a great compliment to the captain's remarks. And this is an observation about the climate change skeptics and how we can address those folks who are still climate change skeptics. And this is about the conclusions of not a group of green environmentalists, but a group that are represented by the captain here today, hard-minded, hard-thinking people from the Pentagon, even beyond the Navy, the entire military force. The DoD, Department of Defense, is thinking about this, as he mentioned, very, very seriously. The quadrennial defense rationale, the program that they have put in place for the document that lays out the Department of Defense's priorities in dealing with those things that may be problems associated with our national security. We'll find that this is a major topic, not only for the Navy, but for the entire Department of Defense to be focusing on. And they're trying to anticipate what the impact of climate change would be on our whole capability of protecting this nation, which of course is the first mission of the military. Environmental degradation and the poverty that is associated with it will, as was mentioned, have an impact upon failing governments or falling governments, many of which are our allies, and the disruption that occurs when governments fall, particularly in less developed areas, has all kinds of political ramifications. The whole idea of conflicts over water shortages, conflicts over water diversions, many major rivers in the world run through numbers of countries, and the fact of the matter is diversions of water can result in tremendously difficult political stresses that can result in military conflict. Conflicts over inadequate food supplies can occur. We can talk about mass migrations which occur, and we see some already in Africa that result in disruptions in the political field. Pandemics which can occur, which cause, again, mass migrations as well as obvious health consequences. The DoD, the Department of Defense, has concluded that the military may be the only institution capable of dealing with some of these problems, to say nothing of our traditional need for interventions where appropriate, many of which may be caused by some of these things, such as mass migrations as well as conflicts over water. So as I said, it's important for us to all appreciate how this issue has to be led to a higher level, so that the public can be aware and have input. Nothing, as I mentioned earlier, nothing is done in a democracy without public awareness, public support for policies. So I would just commend everyone who's responsible for this program today, because in some respects we're undertaking a patriotic initiative. And so for that I congratulate all who are responsible. Thank you very much.
Let's have one final round of applause for superb luncheon presentations. Our resident logistics expert will now tell us what we're going to do next. Jean?
We're going to enjoy the molten chocolate cake. We're here for another 15 minutes or so, and then we're going to head back to the Blaustein School for our breakout sessions that will start promptly at 2 o'clock. Again, in your packet, you will find a page that's called Afternoon Breakout Sessions, which gives you the room assignments. When you registered for the conference, we asked you to identify what session you might want to sit in. We're not holding you to that. You can change your mind when you actually go to that session. The Public Health and Environmental Justice session will be in room 168. The infrastructure session will be in the Special Events Forum, which is what we call the auditorium where we were this morning. The Watershed, Rivers, and Coastal Adaptation to Climate Change session will be in room 369. And the Agriculture and Natural Resource session will be in room 170. But again, that sheet is in your folder. So those breakout sessions will start promptly at 2 o'clock. I'll remind you of a couple other things as well. Please remember that when you're in the hallways at the Blaustein School to keep your voices low. We are actively in session of classes right now. Please refrain from cell phone use in the hallways. You can use your cell phone in the atrium, in the lobby, in the main building. And then also, just 2 other reminders. In your packet is an evaluation form. Before you leave today, if you could fill that out, there'll be a basket or a box right by the auditorium that you can put that in, as well as your badge that we'll recycle. So please enjoy your dessert and the great company, and we'll see you over at the Blaustein School for breakout sessions that start again at 2 o'clock. And thank you to everyone from our lunchtime session who participated. Thank you.